Hello, I'm Don Marsh, and welcome to St. Louis on the Air. Missouri's reputation as a microcosm of the nation is nothing new. It was certainly that a century and a half ago when it was a slave state with largely Union sympathies, but there was a considerable secessionist support as well, and the Show Me State sent men off to war to fight for both the North and the South. All of these sympathies were evident in St. Louis before and during the war years. While the area produced no battles on a par with Gettysburg, Bull Run, or Shiloh, it did play an important role. In fact, 1,200 battles and skirmishes were fought in this state. We'll talk about all of that today with Gary Carter. She turned an important diary left behind by her great-great-grandfather, Franklin Dick, into the book, Troubled State, Civil War Journals of Franklin Archibald Dick. Also with us is Greg Wolk. He's an attorney who is also president of Missouri's Civil War Heritage Foundation. Thanks very much, folks, for being with us today. Nice to have you. Greg, I'm sorry. I'm going to be confused about the Gary and Greg thing. I've already made that mistake twice, once on the air, once off. But, Greg, let me begin with you, if I could. Could you kind of set the stage for us and give us the thumbnail description of what the climate was like in Missouri just as the war was approaching?
We have to go back really to the Missouri Compromise, and I think most listeners have some knowledge of that. But
I would hope so.
That was back in 1820, and Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state, but geographically it was very, very far north of the existing slave states. I think, as we all know, there was a period of time when compromises were attempted, but as 1860 approached, Missouri had a strange demographic. There were many, many slaveholders in the central part of the state along the Missouri River corridor, what we call the Boonslick. And meanwhile, there was a huge influx of European immigrants, mostly coming to St. Louis, and they supplemented or complemented, I might say, the mostly German population that had settled the eastern part of the Missouri Valley. So as the 1860 approached, we were divided. I think it might be said that the earlier residents, the ones that populated the Boonslick, the Southerners, still controlled the politics of the state, perhaps inordinately given their numbers. So the stage was set really for the battle between the eastern industrialists centered in St. Louis and the more agrarian community that was very much like the Deep South in the center part of the state.
Sort of a political, philosophical schizophrenia, as I would call it.
Yeah.
Gary Carter, let me turn to you now, and we'll talk about your great-great-grandfather's journal in just a moment. But you know an awful lot about what was going on in St. Louis at this time. Describe it as you see it and from some of the things you learned from your kin.
Good morning. I learned a whole lot from reading these journals. Franklin Dick came to St. Louis in 1842 to practice law, and he'd worked for almost 20 years to set up a law practice, make friends, be part of the community. And then, because he was brother-in-law to Frank Blair, all of a sudden he got pulled into all these unionist political feelings, and he started having secret meetings in his law office at night of the group of men who were really for the Union. They were afraid to say anything because Governor Jackson was saying he was for the Union but was really secretly for the South, and a lot of people were doing that. At the time, it was a really difficult time to live in St. Louis, and everybody was keeping quiet about their true beliefs, but they were actively, secretly behind the scenes doing different things. And I guess the story that I love the most is after these secret meetings started, that on the 9th of May in 1861, Frank Blair and Franklin Dick borrowed their mother-in-law, Myra Alexander's dress, and they stuffed Nathaniel Lyon, who was here as a captain, into that dress. And Mrs. Alexander was blind, and so they put her hat and veil on him and put him in her carriage with her coachman and sent him into Camp Jackson to see what was going on and see if there were really secret arms there and whether they needed to be aware and do anything about it. And on Nathaniel Lyon's lap was an egg basket. And in the egg basket was hidden a gun in the bottom. But luckily he didn't have to use that. And when he came back and they all met, they realized that there really was stuff going on secretly in Camp Jackson. So
We ought to back up just a little bit from that, but the bottom line is that what Greg here has just described as this division outstate, the same kind of divisions were very much evident here in St. Louis.
Absolutely, absolutely. The same things were going on, very much so.
When did all of this start? I mean, we know that the Missouri Compromise can be a date, 1820, a date that we can look at is where the things began to fester somewhat. But when did the concerns over the potential for war start? Was it much before the war, or did it really come to the fore as war broke out?
I think it was starting perhaps a year beforehand, very slowly and subtly in different ways, from what I can gather from my great-great-grandfather's journals. And then all of a sudden things started happening really fast.
What were communications like in those days? I guess it was all telegraph. They didn't have to wait very long to find out that Fort Sumter had been fired upon.
Yes, true. It was telegraph, but letters and word of mouth as people traveled. They had the trains, so people could travel a little faster than horseback then. Okay.
Greg, Gary mentioned Fort Jackson, or Camp Jackson, I guess I should call it here. What can you tell us about that? What was its significance?
Camp Jackson existed on the campus now of St. Louis University, south east corner of Grand and what is now Lindell, or actually Olive. There is dispute about what the intentions were. This was the Missouri State Militia that was, I guess, legally bound every year to go into camp for their training. So the Governor Jackson, chose this spot, at least a district of the Missouri militia went into camp there. I believe it was early May. And meanwhile, regular federal troops and volunteers were collecting in large numbers down at the St. Louis Arsenal.
Which was where?
It was and still is at the foot of Arsenal Street across from the Brewery on Broadway.
Right. So we have federal troops on the one hand, we had state troops on the other, and we have a governor who is secretly a secessionist.
Right, and that was all about control of the arsenal. Each side wanted all the arms that were in there. And so actually Governor Jackson's first idea was to have General Frost do the muster at the arsenal. But Nathaniel Lyon and Frank Blair learned about it, and so they quickly got the Wide Awake clubs and the local guys there at the militia and set up all around, at the arsenal, and set up all around there. And on the Heights as well, that was the other place. And because they had set themselves up there, General Frost had no other place to go but Lindell Grove.
I think we have to be careful. I know it's difficult for you who know the subject so well to assume that we all know such things as whose side General Lyons was on and what the Wide Awake clubs were, if you will.
Sorry.
That's all right.
The Wide Awakes, what happened, there were a lot of Irish and German immigrants in St. Louis then, and they were kind of looked down upon by the old St. Louisans. So Frank Blair went around to the Germans and he got them into these clubs that he called Wide Awake clubs, and they were to be aware and alert of what was going on politically. And they weren't technically anything to do with war or the Union or anything else. They were just to organize them into cohesive groups. And then later on, he was able to organize to be local troops, and then once he got the go-ahead to make them federal, then they were federal troops. So that's what that was. Nathaniel Lyon was a captain who was sent here from Kansas, and he was sent to the Jefferson Barracks and had just arrived just before all this stuff started. And he was on the side of the Union. He had seen what had happened in Bleeding, Kansas. So he was very much in tune with Frank Blair and Franklin Dick. And Franklin Dick talks about meeting Lyon and talking in his office many, many days. They were quite good friends. And he mentions that Lyon's uniform wasn't always very neat, that he was a little messy.
There must have been a significant amount of arms at the arsenal for everybody to be so concerned about controlling them.
It was the largest collection of arms and armaments in the western United States. I think I recall something like 50,000 muskets, some of which were shipped to Illinois before all this came to a head. But it was a very, very significant facility.
Why all those weapons here?
This was, Jefferson Barracks had been formed, I think it was 1826, and the arsenal dates to just about the same time. This was the principal Army base for quite some time that covered the western frontier.
So that basically it had nothing to do with what was going on in the east, but rather what might be coming in the west, Indian wars and things of that nature.
Yes, and what had happened early in 1861 is in certain southern states, the federal arsenals were attacked. They were attacked, not necessarily attacked. In some cases, they just gave up. So the expectation was that there would be a move on the St. Louis arsenal as well, and it's, as they say, was the largest one in the western United States.
Scary.
And what had happened, too, just before Nathaniel Lyon went in with the egg basket on his lap into Camp Jackson, is that some arms that had been taken from one of the other southern arsenals were sent in boxes labeled Tamaroa marble up to St. Louis to the levee, and they were secretly brought into Camp Jackson. So that's how they got their arms.
So there's really a significant undercurrent of activity going on here.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't think most people, when they think about Missouri's role in the Civil War, would really have an appreciation for the strategic importance of the state as a result of just the muskets and armaments that were here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And another thing Franklin Dick did, too, before all this started, is he took his family and Frank Blair's family to safety in Philadelphia because they were so scared. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were terrified for their wives and children.
You said something before we went on the air, and I want to get back to the discovery of the journals and what have you. We're kind of bouncing around here a little bit. But you said something before we went on the air that people should know, and that is the concerns that he had with regard to possibly finding itself the meat in between the two slices of bread and a sandwich. You go ahead and explain what I'm talking about.
What he talks about over and over again in these journals is the fear that Great Britain would come into the war on the side of the South. And if so, then Canada, the English would invade from Canada and also from the South, and the Union would just be squashed in between. And I'd read that in the history books, as I told you, but then reading it over and over again in these journals, I realized how terrifying it must have been to have lived with that fear. And it was equally as hard on the southern side. It was not easy for anybody during this time.
It also illustrates, I think, another thing that people sometimes forget is that the economic influence on the actual outbreak of the war. Most people think it's a slave issue. I say most people. Many people think it's a slave issue when really economics were at its heart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The thing that Franklin Dick talks about, too, that really struck me, he calls himself a tree in a movable vessel because he was trying so hard to put down roots in St. Louis, but because of the war, all his plans were disrupted. So he was the tree in the movable vessel, which is how we live our lives now in today's world. But in those days, you didn't. You went someplace and stayed, and he couldn't do that.
Yeah, there are so many stories that come out of it of individuals whose obviously the lives disrupted. That goes needless to say. We have to take a break now. Let's do that. We are discussing the Civil War with special emphasis on the Missouri and St. Louis role therein. We'll continue our discussion in just a moment. We have with us Gary Carter. She's the author of Troubled States, Civil War Journals of Franklin Archibald Dick. Franklin Archibald Dick is her great-great-grandfather. And journals very, very important to the history of that period and the history of that period here in the St. Louis area. Also with us is Greg Wolk, attorney and president of Missouri's Civil War Heritage Foundation. We'll come back and talk more about this period. We're certainly going to encourage your questions, too. Perhaps you don't know as much as you think you did or would like to know about that period. We'd like to hear from you. Or perhaps you found some documents from old family members that you'd like to share with us. We'd love to hear from you at 382-8255. Back in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air, 90.7 KWMU. Hello again and welcome back to St. Louis on the Air. Don Marsh with you. I have with me in studio, and happily so, Gary Carter, author of Troubled States, Civil War Journals of Franklin Archibald Dick. He was a prominent citizen of St. Louis during the years of the Civil War, and she discovered through family archives journals of his that are very important to the history of that period. And also with us, a gentleman who is very much interested in the history of that period. That would be Greg Wolk. He's an attorney and president of the Missouri Civil War Heritage Foundation. Tell us, if you will, Gary, about the journals, how you found them, how long you've had custody of them, and the excitement over finding them.
That's an interesting story. My 93-year-old mother gave them to me years ago. And when she gave them to me, I was very young. I had no idea about writing. I was busy doing other things. I speak a bunch of languages, and I was using those in different jobs. And then in the 80s, I was in a big car accident. And it took 10 years to reconstruct my face after that. And I took a creative writing class. And the teacher said we had to write about something in our lives, and I wrote about the accident, and she said, "You have a book here." And that was my first book, Healing Myself. When I finished that book and finished the year on the road with that book, then I thought, what am I going to write next? I don't want to go through another car accident. Mm-hmm. And then I remembered the journals my mother had given me, and I took a look at them, and I was amazed because I'd studied the East Coast in college when we studied the Civil War. And with this book, all of a sudden, I was fascinated. It was just like a page-turner. It was really hard to read because his writing was Spencerian script. So it took me essentially 10 years to get the book together and ready to be published.
Hundreds of pages of documents.
Yes.
What compelled him to put all of this down? Do you have any idea?
It was his private, secret journal. In those years, men couldn't show emotions. Only women could show emotions. So he wrote his private thoughts. He wrote a lot of worry. He wrote his opinions of Lincoln, for example, that he didn't think Lincoln was very good at doing war, that he was more of a negotiator and a peaceful man and not a war man. He wrote his innermost thoughts. And at first I thought, my gosh, what am I doing to this poor man making these journals public? And then when I came to St. Louis in January for the book launch with the Civil War Roundtable, they said, usually we just get to read somebody's opinion on what is in the history books. And here's a first-hand account again, and we're so excited to read this. And then I realized what a gift it is to all of us.
There is, I suppose, an assumption that everyone who was on the Union side during this period was a great fan of Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case.
Well, this was his private thought. He was very much a Union man. He was very patriotic, but secretly he was really concerned about what was going on.
Was it he who called Lincoln cowardly?
No, he did not.
So, in some of the documents that I've read in getting ready for this program, and I wish I had it in front of me here, do you know, Greg, who called him cowardly? I'll try to find that as we're talking. Dick's opinion. I have Dick's opinion of Lincoln cowardly. Somehow I got that from some of the material that I've had. In any case, strike all that, everybody. It's false. It's false. If you will, Greg, tell us your thoughts about the general feeling about President Lincoln during this period.
Well, I was fascinated. Of course, it's an excellent book that Gary's written, and I didn't know Franklin Dick's relationship to the Blair family. What was going on the political side was fascinating. Montgomery Blair was Lincoln's postmaster general. He was the older brother of Frank Blair, both of whom had practiced law here in St. Louis. They were Kentuckians, and they were from another of the border states. Lincoln, when he was elected, and I hope I don't offend any Lincoln scholars here, but his platform was not rabidly anti-slavery. And when he was elected, of course, he gave a lot of concern to a lot of people. But as the coming war unfolded, it was pretty clear that, I think to Lincoln particularly, that his official position, he had to moderate the slavery issue because he had to keep the border states, that is Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, in the Union. The journals mentioned that it was, in fact, Franklin Dick who went to visit Montgomery Blair, his brother-in-law, to ask for the recall of General Harney, who was the regular Army officer in charge of Jefferson Barracks and the Arsenal and the whole military operation here.
Asked for the recall. Why?
Well, this is personal theory. Just as perhaps it's true that Governor Jackson was saying one thing and believing another, I think the same might be said for the Lincoln administration. They needed to keep the slave-owning Unionists, and there was a large block of those in Missouri, from getting skittish about what was going on. So they officially, I think, and through General Harney, had been playing the role of compromiser. But unofficially, it was the Blair family and the Dick family, now I learn, who were, I guess you would say, lobbying to get someone like Nathaniel Lyon here. So what happened was Nathaniel Lyon came here as a captain, regular Army captain. General Harney had to visit Washington, I believe, just when the Camp Jackson matter unfolded. And then General Harney came back the day after the incident. He was soon recalled, and he was taken out of the picture altogether because, I think, the Lincoln administration wanted to get aggressive in Missouri, but at the same time wanted to pretend like they weren't. So, again, I'm kind of rattling on here a little bit.
Well, it's fascinating, once again, kind of this undercurrent that I've mentioned before. I guess no one really knew, in many cases, whom they could trust. Exactly right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Gary, if you would, we keep referring to Camp Jackson. Tell us about the Camp Jackson incident, if you will, and what immediately followed.
Well, my great-great-grandfather was Assistant Adjutant General to Nathaniel Lyon at Camp Jackson, and he was this quiet little lawyer who had no idea of being anything military whatsoever in his life, who was suddenly there. And at Camp Jackson, he writes in his journal that after they'd finished marching the scoundrels, as he calls them, out of the camp, then all of a sudden shots rang out, and his first reaction was to get out of the way like everybody else, and then he remembered he had a job to do, and he looked and he saw that Nathaniel Lyon was on foot trying to get the men to stop shooting, and nobody could hear him or see him because he was on foot instead of on his horse. So Franklin Dick rode, he said, 50 to 75 yards in front of all these men who were shooting, commanding them in the name of Nathaniel Lyon to stop shooting. And he writes this in really dark ink and underlines the whole thing because this was so incongruous for him. And then once it was all over, then Nathaniel Lyon wanted to go inside the camp and take a look, and he asked Franklin Dick to go with him. And Franklin Dick writes how upset Nathaniel Lyon was and how he kept saying, "Oh, poor creatures, and that his countenance was almost that of a woman, which is not something that was socially acceptable in those days. Sure. And you hear of Lyon as this hard-bitten, rabid Union general, and instead his personal side is very much shown in these journals. So different things were happening that I've read here than what I'd learned in the history books. That's what I'm so grateful about.
Sure, and the riots that followed all of this, several dozen people, a couple of dozen people anyway, were killed, were they not?
Yes. And also Captain Totten, who was in charge of the artillery, came up to Lyon after this and said, whispered in his ear and told him if he rode back through the city, he was being watched and he'd be shot. So Franklin Dick writes that they had to ride back to the arsenal by the outskirts at a gallop, which was not something else he was used to doing either.
Sure, absolutely. Weren't there, did you want to add something to that?
Well, a little more background, if I may.
By all means.
Fort Sumter was fired on in mid-April of 1861. We're now several weeks later, 3 weeks later. We talked a little bit about what had happened to precipitate this, but what really all that happened is Lyon took his troops from the arsenal up to arrest the people in the Missouri militia. Now, I want to say from the Southern perspective, first of all, Nathaniel Lyon is the devil incarnate.
Sure.
And secondly, people make the case, and there is a case to be made that what Lyon did was absolutely illegal. But it was peaceable. The Missouri militia troops were taken into custody, and they were lined up on Olive Street to take them down to the arsenal. The story I've heard is that in the midst of all this, Lyon was kicked in the stomach by a horse and went unconscious. Right?
Yes, that's why
This
he was
is
on
a
the ground.
fabulous story. Meanwhile, the troops had lined up. They had their prisoners on Olive Street, and it was, I guess, warm, and and something happened. It's a little bit of a shade of Kent State, I might say. One story, and believe me, there's always two sides.
Sure.
You understand. One story is that a civilian who was watching it threw a clod of dirt. The commander of one of these unions, a Polish fellow named Konstantin Blandowski was his name, yelled some exclamation, and the Union troops began to fire in the crowd. The other version, of course, is that the Union troops just fired into the crowd. But these were the first casualties, essentially, of the American Civil War. And a lot of people don't realize that. And, in fact, Blandowski was the first officer in the Civil War who was mortally wounded in any sort of...
Right here.
Right here.
Another item that is lost, I think, to many people in the history of the war. Think of Fort Sumter, and here we go. Here's where the first real bloodshed was.
And Franklin Dick writes a slightly different version of that too. So there are a lot of different versions, but he was right there. He saw it all happen. So I don't know. Who knows what's right?
Yeah, well, at least we have the opportunity now to read a first-hand account of it, and we don't have to speculate on what might have happened to a certain degree. Anyway, I'd like to go to the phones. We have a number of issues that people want to talk about here, so we'll be bouncing around a little bit. And before we go, I want to let everyone know we're going to tell you about not only more about the book that Gary Carter has put together here, but also about another book that Greg's organization is very proud of, and also where Gary will be appearing this weekend. She's got a couple of signings you'll want to know about. But let's go to the phones and get you guys in on it. Ed is calling from St. Louis. Ed, you're first up today. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, I'm holding former Senator Paul Simon's book about Elijah P. Lovejoy, and I was not aware of him until about 10 years ago, and that in 1837 he was killed, basically in Alton, Illinois, and for freedom of the press, and that we don't know about that and use him as an example of freedom of the press, and that what happened to him was really kind of a catalyst for kind of inspiring John Brown to get quite upset, and then what happened in Kansas with Missouri ruffians going over, and all that tied in, and that I really wasn't aware of it until the last 10 years. I mean, the lack of education we have about this subject and the importance of, to me, freedom of the press, that Elijah P. Lovejoy was killed for, and it was, and we don't talk about that, and we don't know about that, and it's right across in Alton, Illinois, and actually he was run out of St. Louis, and then he got killed over in Alton.
Ed, thanks for the call. Yes, I think Elijah Lovejoy is well known to a lot of people. It's all interconnected because he was the great abolitionist, and that was the thing, one of the impetus driving toward the Civil War and Dred Scott and all the rest of it. Anything you want to say to his comments?
It was very difficult with the press during the Civil War, and Franklin Dick writes about that as well, especially when he was Provost Marshal General. It was especially difficult with the newspapers.
What was difficult?
Well, they weren't allowed to report anything of troop movements, either the southern newspapers or the northern ones. And because of that, he was always trying to find out what was happening in the news. And it was very difficult for anybody on a newspaper then.
Even given his position, he was unable to get information that might have been important to conducting that office?
I think he probably got secret information, but they even had to be careful with the telegraph because they never knew who was going to intercept what. So,
and yet there's no indication through his writings that he had that information, was frustrated because he couldn't proclaim it or publicize it.
No.
All right. No. Let's return to the folks in the audience here. I'd like to pick it up with Anthony if we could. Anthony, thank you so much for being with us. You're on the air.
Well, Well, first thing, I didn't. I've known Greg for quite a while and didn't know that he was a historian.
I'm not, Anthony.
And secondly, I traced my family back to Central Missouri and found that I might be related to a Glover named, who was the lieutenant governor at the time, if not the lieutenant governor, certainly a high state official, and I could never pin it down. I wonder if that name is familiar to anybody, and what was his role in all that we're talking about today.
The name is Glover.
Yes.
Let's see if we can figure that out here.
Probably from around Fulton, Missouri.
Okay.
I know there was a Glover, I think, as you mentioned in your book,
Right.
who was a colonel out of St. Louis, but that's the only one I'm familiar with.
Well, the one I write about is Samuel T. Glover. His dates are 1813 to 1884, and he kept a rifle in plain sight in his law office at Fifth and Olive in St. Louis to remind clients that he was a Unionist. He was a friend of Franklin Dix, and he was a member of the original St. Louis Committee of Safety. And he advised Lyon not to attack Camp Jackson and to deal with it legally with a writ of replevin. But he was outvoted. So I'm not sure if that's your ancestor or not, but that's the one who Franklin Dick talks about in his journals.
Well, it's a pretty good story, Anthony. If I were you, I'd just accept that as your relative and go from there. Thank you so much for the call. I hope that was a help to you. We have to take another break now. We'll do that and come back and continue our discussion about some of the local history of the Civil War. We have with us in the studio Gary Carter, who was an author and whose book, Troubled State, Civil War Journals of Franklin Archibald Dick, is something she'll be talking about this weekend. Also with us is Greg Wolk. He is president of Missouri's Civil War Heritage Foundation. We'll come back and talk to you. Number of calls. Folks have some interesting things they want to talk about. We'll do that when we return. This is St. Louis on the Air, 90.7 KWMU. Hello again. Welcome back to St. Louis on the Air. Our discussion today centers on the Missouri and St. Louis role in the Civil War. And there's obviously many more things that we can talk about than we have time to, but we'll get to as much of it as we can. But first, I want to advise there are at least a couple of signings that I'm aware of that Gary Carter, one of our guests, is going to be involved in this weekend, both at the History Museum, both at 2 p.m. Saturday, she'll be in the museum's Louisiana Purchase Museum shop. Sunday, the museum's Lee Auditorium. These are 4 signings, and we have links to the museum website where you can get more information. Jot down these phone numbers, 314-454-3172. Let me give you that again, 314-454-3172 for the Saturday event, 314-361-7229 for Sunday signing. But that's just part of it. Gary, you have other things going on that I wasn't even aware of.
Yes, sir. I'm busy while I'm here, and I'm
Great.
really glad to be back in St. Louis. Tonight I'll be speaking in Highland, Illinois at the Civil War Roundtable at the First Congregational Church at 7 o'clock. And then tomorrow I'll be at Wilson's Creek Battlefield speaking at 4 in the afternoon. And then Saturday is a book signing at the museum, and Sunday I'm speaking
It's a talk.
at 2 o'clock. Yes, that is a talk. And so I'll tell the stories of Franklin Dick then. And look forward to seeing whoever can get there to any of those events. Thank you.
Again, we have information on our website, so folks, if they didn't get that all, can go to the web, kwmu.org. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention something that I know you're very proud of, Greg, that being this book, In Deadly Earnest.
Yes, our organization has reprinted a very, very excellent book that was first published in the early 1990s. And it's called In Deadly Earnest, The Missouri Brigade, written by Phil Gottschalk, who was a journalist up in Columbia for many, many, many years. This was an award winner for it's the Douglas Southall Freeman Award back in the early 90s for the best work in Southern literature that year.
And it focuses on what?
Pardon me?
It focuses on what aspect of the subject matter here?
This is a Southern brigade. This was a brigade that fought with the Confederacy, obviously recruited in Missouri. I can quote from Ed Bars, who is the chief historian emeritus now of the Missouri Park Service, and he said that the Missouri Brigade makes the Stonewall Brigade look like the Little Sisters of the Poor. And it's true. This was just a marvelous organization.
Well, it's a big book. I'll advise folks of that, and people who are interested in this period of history. It's something worth looking at, as is the one that we're basically here to talk about today, which would be Gary Carter's book, written by her, or the journals of her great-great-grandfather. Let's return to the phones and get more of our listeners in on the conversation. We'll pick it up with Gerald calling from U-City. Gerald, thanks for being with us. You're on the air.
Thanks. I just wondered if Miss Carter has ever heard of the book Enemy Women. It's about the women in Missouri and how the Civil War affected the women. They have a whole section on St. Louis, too, because this woman ended up in the St. Louis prisons for a while. And I'm not a buff of the Civil War, but this book was recommended by the Missouri Historical Society, and I was really enthralled by it.
Well, thank you. No, I don't know about that book, and I'd really like to read it, so I'm very glad that you told me about it. Thanks.
Enemy Women, is that the title, Gerald?
Yes, I don't know the author, but Enemy Women.
Okay, well, that's something
to
jot down and look for. Let's go to Clifford, also calling from St. Louis. Clifford, nice to have you as part of the conversation. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've always heard about a battle at the Grand Water Tower by German brewers and Irish gandy dancers and black freemen that met the Confederate forces that came in from St. Charles, which I believe was the state capital at that time. Can you illuminate on this?
We'll try.
Clifford, I think there was a fort on the site of the Grand Water Tower. It was built by the Union forces in 1861. As far as I know, that was never used in any battle. But, of course, I could be wrong.
Okay, Clifford, thanks for pointing that out to us, and hope that is helpful to you. By the way, Mary Edwards, the producer of this program, has just advised me that Enemy Women is by Paulette Giles. She's been on this program. I wish I had been there at the time when she was, but that's it. Paulette Giles, Giles, for Gary, for you, and for other listeners who might be interested. Back to the phones, and Mark calling from St. Louis. Go ahead, Mark, you're on the air.
Hi, I heard mention earlier in the program kind of about the causes of the Civil War, and I guess this is more of a broad point. I think it's become kind of fashionable over the past few years to say that, the causes of the war weren't based in slavery. It was more of an economic issue. But I think actually it's really impossible to remove slavery from the reasons for the Civil War, both economically and morally. I think you had two incompatible economies and two incompatible moral systems between the North and the South. The North was practicing, this free labor economy that was really incompatible with an economy in the South based on slavery. So that while, maybe it wasn't fought for the same, just moral concerns, the economic component really can't be removed from the fact that slavery was central to it.
Mark, thanks so much for the call. Any disagreement with what Mark has said?
No, it certainly was a part of it. There were just a lot of other factors. It's hard to say which was the one prevailing reason because there were so many. But I think Mark is quite right. That's a good point.
I agree with him.
Greg, why specifically did Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, it was a war measure. It was one that I understand it was resisted for quite some time. And curiously enough, of course, in Missouri, it didn't free any slaves. It only freed slaves in parts of the South that were in rebellion against the United States government.
And I think in Texas, they didn't bother to tell the slaves until about 2 years after it was issued. I believe that's what Juneteenth is all about.
I think it was June of 1865.
Right.
It was sometime after the war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, anything to add to that? Did I interrupt? I thought I had interrupted you. Okay,
no.
All right. Let's return to the phone. Speaking of Mr. Lincoln, we have Richard on the line who wants to utter that name, I believe. Go ahead, Richard. You're on the air.
Thank you. Gregory?
Yes.
This question is for you. From a legal viewpoint, and that is in the election of 1864, the presidential, troops in the front were permitted to vote. And then, of course, there was a voter count in St. Louis, and then in St. Louis there were many German and foreign immigrants. And as I understand, if you arrived as an immigrant, you could vote in the next election, whether it was a few days away or 1 year away. There was no residency test. Can you comment in general on the results of of President Lincoln's second run as a candidate, and how many people went for Lincoln, or what were the other issues?
That's the most interesting legal question that's ever been posed to me.
Thank you.
But I'm not sure I am qualified to answer it. I'll just comment on 1864. I think the caller referred to. Yeah. There were not a lot of people in St. Louis who were recent immigrants. I would say that.
Most of them came in the 40s and 50s, didn't they?
Yeah.
Before that, even. Yeah. There were more immigrants, as I understand it, in St. Louis in 1850 than there were in New York City at the same time.
As of 1860, St. Louis had the highest proportion of people of foreign birth of any city in the United States.
And as has been pointed out in this program, they're terrifically important during this period. They're very influential, and they were. Tell me, would you say, almost universally on the Union side of this thing, or were they also divided?
Well, Frank Blair worked really hard to get them on the Union side. They were almost entities unto themselves when they arrived because they stayed in their little groups. And so he very much tried to get them on the Union side before the Southerners could do the same thing. So everybody was working behind the scenes doing the same sort of thing.
And we go back to this undercurrent that was taking
Absolutely.
place. You wanted to mention something about Camp Jackson that you failed to mention before.
One other thing I forgot to say is that one of my other ancestors was at Camp Jackson that day, and that was Ferdinand Louis Garishay, from which my name Gary comes. And he, after all the people were marched back to the arsenal and offered paroles, could not be given a parole. 3 people didn't get paroles. 2 chose not to accept them, and they came back to haunt Franklin Dick when he was Provost Marshal General. But Ferdinand Louis Garishay was too young to have a parole, so he had to be released into the custody of his parents. And the Garishay family was very divided during the Civil War. One was a famous Union general, another was a priest whose sermons were so rabidly pro-South he had to be sent away from St. Louis by the church. And then Alexander J.P. Garishay was a famous lawyer who was called Alphabet Garishay in the newspapers, and he was hated by Franklin Dick because he was pro-South. And his descendant then married Franklin Dick's eldest son. So that's how I get the name Garishay.
And not the only examples, by the way, of families divided by the Civil War.
Absolutely.
Anything to add, Greg? Before
let me mention one man who refused the parole was a guy named Emmett McDonald.
Yes.
And this is a legal question again now. Emmett McDonald sued. He was imprisoned because he didn't get the parole. And the federal court in St. Louis agreed with him that whole action was illegal. Emmett McDonald was killed in 1863 as a Confederate cavalry officer down in southwest Missouri. But he made some law for it.
But then the real problem was when his body came back to St. Louis, that's when Franklin Dick was Provost Marshal General and had to deal with that. Well, 2 bodies at the same time. And that was a big, big controversy.
What was the actual duties of the Provost Marshal General?
It was really hard. Missouri was under military law for the whole Civil War. So in each little town, there was a local provost marshal who had to maintain law and order, deal with spies, deal with prisoners, whoever the local troops arrested, the provost marshal had to take care of them, have them sent to St. Louis, and then they were either exchanged to the South or put in federal prisons. So Franklin Dick, as the provost marshal general, had to supervise all of that. He had to try to figure out who was a spy and who wasn't. He had to deal with banishments. A lot of people were banished, wives as well as pro-Southern people.
Banished for, typically?
Banished for there were certain degrees of Southern sympathizers. And once they reached a certain degree, a certain level of having sympathy for the South, then they were on the list to be potentially banished.
And where were they banished to?
They were banished all different sorts of places. Some had specific regions where they could go.
Out of state.
Totally out of state, absolutely. Most were banished to the South.
Right.
And it was just really sad. Families were torn up. With the assessment committee on which he served before he was Provost Marshal General, the Southern sympathizers were assessed money or their property was seized.
I was going to say that those banished, I assume their property was seized.
Well, this was way before they even got to the banishments.
Oh,
so there were all these levels of it. And for this, he was hated by the Southerners and the conditional unionists.
Tough job.
It was difficult.
Oh,
he was
sure it
just
was.
trying to do what he felt was right.
Let's return to the phones. Tony has an interesting aspect to all of this for landlocked, if you will, Missouri. Tony, go ahead. You're on the air.
Good day. Please speak to the degree and the ways in which St. Louis was a naval port for the Union, and was there any fighting along the river in Missouri? The Kentucky forts fell back and forth, and it's fun to mention that. One county in Missouri ceded from everyone. I think it was Callaway County, Kingdom City. And slavery is economic, and it's also political when you have a 3/5 clause that builds it into the electoral system. Thank you.
Thanks for calling. You going to take that one?
On
Greg?
the river, the war on the river.
Yeah.
The closest battle, I guess I would say, involving river war was in a place called south of Cape Girardeau, a place called Belmont. That was a battle, actually U.S. Grant's first battle as a commander in the field in November of 1861. What St. Louis is most famous for, and I feel like I'm going to be talking about all these first, and that's really, of course, one of the reasons I'm here. James Buchanan Eads, who, of course, built the Eads Bridge after the war, built ironclad river transports down in Carondelet. The fact is, the first one that he produced in October of 1861 was the first ironclad warship in the Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
That was called the USS St. Louis, and then later changed to another name. Unfortunately, we're still looking for the site of Mr. Eads' shipyard, and hopefully we'll find that before the 150th anniversary.
Presumably it's someplace near the river. I mean, that's a good place to start. I have an email here, unsigned. It says, I hope your guests will address the Civil War origins of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department coming under state control. Can anyone deal with that?
That was another big controversy because the police essentially were under the control of the governor. And so that's something that Franklin Dick and Frank Blair were really worried about. And eventually they were able to get that out from under the thumb of the governor's control and have it more federal.
Weren't there two separate governments at one point here in Missouri?
At one point, there were two separate governors, yes.
So how did that work? Or not work?
That was from the pro-Southern legislature. Well, I should defer to you.
Okay. Well, again, from the Southern perspective, frankly, there was a coup d'etat. And in fact, the argument can be made to that. We go back to Lyon, and I might say the current St. Louis Board of Police Commissioners is still a result of what happened just before the war, because the southern-leaning state government decided that they didn't want St. Louis controlling its own police force. And I think what Gary's alluding to is, in fact, there were a lot of civilians who became like policemen. But, in fact, the St. Louis Police Department has always been under state control since that time. Anyway, I probably did lose my thought about the other point I was going to.
Regarding the development of the St. Louis Police Department was the basic question. We only have a few seconds left. The Civil War origins of the Metropolitan Police Department. I think you've probably gotten to that point. Unfortunately, there is so much here. There is so much history during this specific period of time, and we can't even begin to scratch the surface. So what we're going to have to do here is just advise folks once again that they can learn an awful lot more by attending some of the events that Gary Carter, our guest today, is going to be involved in. You tell us about what's happening in the next day or two, and I'll tell them what's happening on the weekend. But we have to do it fairly quickly.
Okay. I'm speaking tonight in Illinois at the Civil War Roundtable in Highland, Illinois, and tomorrow at Wilson's Creek Battlefield, and Saturday and Sunday at the Missouri History Museum at 2 o'clock, signing on Saturday and speaking on Sunday.
Okay,
Thanks.
you've covered it all, and obviously you can get into a lot more detail of some of the things that we've raised today. And Greg, just with you very quickly.
Please go to the Lee and Grant exhibit at the Missouri History Museum. You can buy our book, you can buy Gary's book in the gift shop, and you will have a wonderful afternoon there.
I will advise our audience as well that we have a link to your organization on our website, kwmu.org, and also information with regard to the book, In Deadly Earnest. Again, I wish we had more time, but I'm so grateful to both of you for being here and at least getting us started on this. Hopefully a lot of people listening today will begin to pursue in greater detail more of the history of the Civil War in this area. Thank you so much. Gary Carter, thank you.
Thank you.
Greg Wolk, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks,